All right, buckle up for a deep dive this time into a case that's both, well, intriguing and really unsettling. We're going to be talking about Michael Bruce Ross.
A name that might not be familiar to everyone.
Yeah, probably not a household name.
No, but his crimes though absolutely horrific. And this is one of those cases that brings up some seriously complex questions.
It does.
What gets me, I guess, right off the bat with Ross is this crazy contrast. I mean, on the one hand, brilliant guy, Ivy League grad, but then on the other hand, you have this string of just brutal murders.
It's hard to wrap your head around.
It really makes you rethink all those ideas we have about, who commits these kinds of crimes.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what we're going to try to unpack today.
Unpack it, yep.
So we've got court records to dig into, biographical info, even some of Ross's own writings.
Wow, okay.
So our mission, should we choose to accept it, is to kind of piece together the puzzle of how this guy, this seemingly brilliant guy, became known as the roadside strangler.
It's a real journey this is going to be into like the darkest corners of human behavior, trying to understand a mind that is capable of academic success, like serious academic success, and then, monstrous act.
It's a lot to take in. So let's start at the beginning, shall we?
Yeah, let's do it.
Ross's childhood back in the late 1950s in Connecticut, from the outside looking in, a pretty normal, rural upbringing. But you start to see these hints of a really troubled family life when you dig deeper.
Yeah, the sources we've got, they paint this picture of an abusive mother. And there are even these suggestions of molestation by an uncle who later, sadly, committed suicide.
Oof, that's heavy.
It is, it is. And these early traumas, these are so often critical factors in the development of violent offenders.
So how does that trauma, how does that manifest itself, like psychologically?
Okay, so think of it like this. Early childhood, that's when we're developing, our understanding of the world, our place in it. And when that environment is just full of abuse or neglect, it can really warp a child's sense of empathy, their ability to form healthy relationships. They might start to see violence as a way to exert control or cope with their own pain.
That makes sense.
It's like a blueprint, but a twisted blueprint for how they're going to interact with people later on.
So in Ross's case, I mean, is it possible then that these early experiences, these awful experiences, actually planted the seeds for the violence that he committed later?
It's a huge factor to consider, yeah. But we have to remember, not everyone who goes through trauma becomes a violent offender, right? There are probably, lots of things at play here: genetic predispositions, environmental things, personal choices. It all contributes to these really extreme behaviors.
So it's a complicated thing, this nature versus nurture thing, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's never a straightforward equation.
Never straightforward. Okay, so we've got this picture of a troubled upbringing, but then you have Ross's academic achievements. He excelled in school, right? Graduated from Cornell, degree in economics.
Yeah, it really is a jarring contrast.
It almost feels like we're talking about two completely different people here.
Yeah, almost.
So do you think that his intelligence, his academic success, do you think that was masking deeper issues? Or could it have even maybe played a part in his crimes?
Now, that's where it gets really, really complex. You see, intelligence, it doesn't mean someone can't have a mental illness or really deep psychological issues. In fact, in some cases, a high intellect might actually be used to rationalize or plan these horrific acts.
That's a scary thought.
Chilling thought, but it's something we have to think about. It's a possibility.
Okay, so picture this. We've got this young man, obviously deeply troubled, but also very intelligent. He graduates from Cornell. What happens next? How does this guy with seemingly, so much promise, how does he become the roadside strangler?
Well, between 1981 and 1984, Ross, he commits at least 8 murders.
8.
His victims, all young women. The youngest was only 14, the oldest was 25.
Ugh.
He often targeted women who were walking alone or hitchhiking, and that's where the nickname, the roadside strangler, comes from.
It's awful. And the details of these crimes are just so disturbing. The sources we've looked at, they describe abduction, rape, strangulation. It's like this pattern of predatory behavior, just a complete lack of empathy for his victims.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. His modus operandi, it really points to this calculated, almost like detached approach to these crimes. And it's that chilling lack of remorse that really sets him apart.
Let's talk about the specific case for a minute. The murders of April Brunet and Leslie Shelley. They were just 14 years old, walking home together when Ross abducted them. I just can't even imagine.
What's especially striking about this case is how brazen the abduction was. It was broad daylight, a seemingly safe environment. It just highlights how vulnerable his victims were and how calculated his crimes were. Ross wasn't just, opportunistic. He was actively searching for young women, often in situations where they were alone and less likely to be able to fight back.
God, it makes you think about how vulnerable we all are, really.
It does, and their story, along with the stories of all his victims, it's just this devastating reminder of the impact, the lasting impact of his actions.
It's easy to get lost in the details of the case, but we can't forget that these are real people with lives, dreams, families. And those families were shattered by his cruelty.
You're absolutely right. We have to remember the human cost of his crimes. Each victim, it creates this ripple effect of pain and loss that extends far beyond just the individual.
It's hard to even fathom.
It is.
So after the murder of Wendy Barrable, his last victim, that's when Ross is finally caught.
And it was witness descriptions of Ross and his car that led police right to him.
Wow.
And once they've got him, he confesses, not just to Wendy's murder, but to all 8 murders.
8.
And the fact that his crimes spanned multiple states, it's just shocking. Connecticut, New York, and there's even a chance he committed crimes in Indiana. So you've got this multi-state element that adds a whole other layer of complexity to the legal stuff.
So we're dealing with a serial killer operating across state lines. How does the justice system even handle a case like that? Where does the trial even happen when the crimes are so spread out?
Well, that's where things get really, really complicated legally. When crimes cross jurisdictions like that, it often means that different law enforcement agencies have to work really closely together, and then you've got to navigate all these different state laws, and sometimes even federal laws come into play. It can create this tangled web of legal proceedings, extradition hearings, and even separate trials.
Sounds like a logistical nightmare.
It can be.
So in Ross's case, did that mean he had to face separate trials and sentencing hearings in different states?
Yeah, pretty much. It dragged the whole process out for years.
I can imagine.
And it raises these really important questions about how efficient our justice system is and how fair it is, especially in cases like this, cases that cross state lines.
Okay, so we've got this Ivy League grad who becomes a serial killer. He's captured, and he's facing this huge legal battle. But here's where things take a really unexpected turn, right? While he's on death row, Ross goes through a massive change. He converts to Catholicism, starts immersing himself in religious activities.
Yeah, this is where the story takes this really interesting turn. It almost seems paradoxical. I mean, you have this person who committed these truly awful acts, and he seems to be experiencing this genuine spiritual awakening.
It's hard to square those two things.
He's meeting with priests, he's praying the rosary, he even gets involved with a Benedictine monastery.
That's wild.
It is wild.
So do you think, I mean, based on the sources that we have, do you think this transformation, this religious transformation, was real? Or was it something else entirely? Was he trying to manipulate the system somehow?
That is a question that people are still debating. Some people think that his conversion was a genuine expression of remorse, a way to find some peace, some comfort while facing his execution. Other people, they see it more cynically. They think it was a calculated move to control how people saw him, to present a better image to the public, to maybe even try to sway the legal outcome.
Yeah, I can see both sides of that.
It's hard to know for sure.
It's a tough one, but we do know that Ross's actions, they went beyond just religious practice, right? He dedicated himself to doing acts of service in prison. He learned Braille to transcribe documents for blind inmates, even sponsored a child in the Dominican Republic.
Yeah, and that does make things even more complicated. Those acts of service, they suggest that he really wanted to make up for what he did, to find some way to redeem himself by helping others. But again, it's tough to separate those actions from his legal situation. Was it real altruism, or was it, a strategic attempt to get some leniency?
It's like a chicken and egg situation. Which came first, the genuine change or the desire for a better outcome?
Exactly. And that's what's so fascinating about this whole case. It makes us face the complexity of human nature, the fact that people are capable of these really dark things, but also capable of seemingly sincere attempts at making things right.
It challenges everything we think we know about criminals and what drives them.
For sure.
Okay, so we've got this, what seems like a real religious conversion, these acts of service. But then Ross throws another curveball. He becomes a vocal supporter of his own execution.
Yeah, that's another twist that just makes everything even more confusing.
It does, and it's something we're going to have to unpack a little bit more.
We will, we
But
will.
but before we get into that decision, I think we need to take a closer look at the specifics of Ross's crimes.
You're right. We need to understand the full extent of his actions, what his victims went through, and what patterns we can see in his crimes to really grasp how complex this guy was.
All right, so listener, that's where we're going to leave it for today.
Stay tuned.
Stay tuned for part 2, where we're going to dig deeper into the chilling details of Ross's crimes and try to figure out what psychological factors might have played a role in those horrific acts.
It's going to be a heavy one.
We left off last time talking about the complexities of Ross's personality and his legal situation. Now I think we should dive into some specific cases, the cases that really solidified his gruesome reputation as the roadside strangler.
Yeah, I think looking closely at these crimes is really important. Not just to understand, how awful they were, but also to maybe see if we can learn anything about Ross's psyche. Like what were his motivations, his methods?
Absolutely. And I think one case that really stands out is the murder of Wendy Barrable, a 17-year-old girl from Griswold, Connecticut. Her story is especially tragic because, well, she was his final victim.
Right, the one that led to his capture.
Exactly. It was June of 1984. Wendy was walking along Route 12 when Ross abducted her. Her body was found 2 days later, abandoned in a field. But the amazing thing is that witness descriptions of Ross and his car, they were so detailed that the police, they went straight to him.
Wow, so it was almost like after all these years of getting away with it, he just got careless. Yeah, maybe there's something different about this last crime, something that made him less cautious. It's hard to say for sure. But what we do know is that once he was arrested, Ross confessed to all of it, not just Wendy's murder, but to 7 other murders as well.
It's a chilling thought to think that he might have kept going, preying on more young women if those witnesses hadn't come forward. And it just speaks to that multi-state nature of his crimes.
Right.
He was in Connecticut, New York, possibly even Indiana. It makes him like a truly mobile predator.
That geographic spread it's fascinating in a dark way. Was he deliberately trying to avoid getting caught by moving around so much, or was it more impulsive? Driven by opportunity and lack of control. Those are the kinds of questions that criminal profilers, they think about all the time, trying to understand serial offenders.
We mentioned earlier the case of April Brunez and Leslie Shelley. They were only 14 years old, abducted while they were walking home together.
Yeah.
Their story just really shows how brazen Ross was.
Absolutely. I mean, he took them in broad daylight in a place that seemed safe. It shows this really disturbing level of confidence. Like, he didn't care about getting caught. It shatters this idea we have that these things only happen in dark alleys.
It really makes you question your sense of safety, especially for young women. Knowing that Ross could just operate so openly, so confidently, it's really unsettling.
It is. It really forces us to confront the fact that these predators, they often blend in, they seem normal, and that's one of the things that keeps us so fascinated and horrified by cases like this. They show us that darkness can be lurking anywhere.
It's a scary thought. So after years of committing these awful crimes, Ross is finally arrested. He's facing multiple trials, the weight of his confessions. And this is where his story takes this really unexpected turn. While he's on death row, he has this profound religious conversion. He becomes a devout Catholic, and he starts immersing himself in acts of service.
Yeah, and this is where it gets even more psychologically complex. We have to ask ourselves, was this change real? Was it a sincere attempt at feeling remorse, at growing spiritually?
Or was it, like some people said, was it a way to manipulate the system to make people feel sorry for him, maybe even try to affect the outcome of his case?
Those are good questions. It's impossible to know for sure what was going on in his head. We can, look at what he did, what he wrote, but we can't get inside his mind. But one thing we can do is think about this phenomenon that's called death row syndrome.
Oh, yeah. I've heard that term before, but can you explain it for our listeners who might not be familiar with it?
Sure. Death row syndrome, it's basically the psychological effects that come from being in solitary confinement for a long time, not knowing what's going to happen and knowing that you're going to be executed. Can manifest in all sorts of ways, like depression, anxiety, hallucinations, even religious conversions.
So are you saying that Ross's conversion, it could have been a symptom of this syndrome instead of a genuine spiritual experience?
Yeah, it's possible. The stress and isolation of being on death row, it's incredibly intense. It can make people seek comfort in religion. It doesn't necessarily mean their faith isn't real or that they don't feel remorse, but it does add another layer of complexity to their motivations.
It's like we're trying to untangle a really complicated knot,
It is.
and each strand of that knot is a different part of Ross's personality, his journey.
You got it. And that's what makes this case so interesting. It challenges us to look beyond those simple explanations, to really dive into the nuances of how people behave and how all these internals and external forces interact.
Absolutely. So we've got this religious conversion, these acts of service, but then Ross throws us another curveball, but he becomes a vocal supporter of his own execution.
Yeah, and that throws everything into question again.
It does.
Was it real remorse, a desire to take responsibility for what he did and spare his victims' families any more pain? Or was it like a symptom of this death row syndrome, a way to try to control his fate when he felt like he had no control at all?
Right, right. And to make things even more complicated, Ross wrote this really long letter before his execution, which was published later. And he tries to explain, his actions, his motives, and why he supported the death penalty.
That letter it's a fascinating document. It's like a glimpse into his mind. But it also creates more questions than it answers.
I think it's time we take a look at that letter. See if we can get any more insight into the mind of Michael Ross.
Let's do it.
So we've spent a lot of time, listener, trying to understand the contradictions of Michael Ross, right? The troubled childhood, the horrific crimes, the unexpected turn to religion, and that baffling support for his own execution. And now we're gonna hear directly from Ross himself through his final letter. I got to warn you, it's not an easy read, but it's an important piece of this whole puzzle.
Yeah, it's a tough one. It's long and it kind of jumps around, and honestly, some parts are just really unsettling. We need to like read it carefully. Keeping in mind that this is the perspective of a convicted serial killer who's trying to make sense of his own life and the things he did.
Exactly. But even within all the rambling, there are these glimpses of insight, these moments where he's trying to explain the unexplainable. For example, he talks about feeling like a monster, like a thing, separate from the person he wanted to be.
Yeah, you see that a lot in the writings of violent offenders. This attempt to distance themselves from the horror of what they did. It's almost like they're trying to convince themselves and us that someone else, something else was responsible.
There's this deep sense of shame, of self-hatred that comes through in the letter. He writes about feeling like fundamentally broken from a young age. You can tell he's desperately searching for an explanation, for the root of the darkness that took over him.
Right. And like we talked about before, it keeps coming back to his rough childhood, the abuse, the neglect. But the thing is, he never uses it as an excuse. He owns up to the pain he caused, the lives he destroyed, and he accepts responsibility for what he did.
That's what's so infusing about this letter. He wants us to understand the things that made him who he was, the trauma that maybe put him on this path, but he also doesn't want us to let him off the hook.
It's like there's this duality inside him. Maybe a real desire to be understood, for people to see him as more than just a monster, but also this acceptance that he has to face the consequences.
And he talks about his conversion to Catholicism, about trying to find peace and forgiveness through faith. He write about praying for his victims, about looking for redemption from God.
And this is where it gets really hard for us. Can we believe that his repentance was real? Should we? Can someone who did such terrible things really find redemption, even when they're about to be executed?
It's a question that's way bigger than anything we can answer here. It's something that people have been debating for centuries.
Right.
But Ross's letter makes us think about it in a really personal way.
Yeah, it forces us to consider the possibility that even the darkest hearts can change. Whether that change is real or just a way to cope with death, that's a question we might never know the answer to.
There's one line in the letter that really stuck with me. He says, "I am not a monster, but I have done monstrous things." It's like he's wrestling with these two truths about himself, trying to figure out how the person he thinks he is could do those horrible things.
It's a perfect example of how paradoxical this whole case is. This idea that someone can be capable of good and evil, compassion and cruelty, all at the same time. It reminds us that the human mind is this vast, mysterious place.
And in the end, he seems to find some peace in accepting that he'll be remembered for his crimes, for the darkness that defined the last part of his life. He writes about wanting to spare his victims' families any more pain, and that's why he didn't fight his execution.
Yeah, it's hard to understand, but it seems like he wanted to find some kind of resolution, some way to atone for the suffering he caused.
The letter ends with this plea for understanding, not for himself, but for bigger issues like mental illness and the things in society that can lead to violence. He wants us to look beyond the headlines, to really understand these complex issues and try to prevent future tragedies.
It's a powerful message, even coming from someone like him. It reminds us that even in the most horrible cases, there are things we can learn, problems we need to address, and a responsibility to try to understand.
So, listener, where does this leave us? We've explored the life and crimes of Michael Bruce Ross, from his troubled childhood to the brutal murders, his unexpected religious conversion, and finally his decision to accept his death. We've gone through court documents, biographical information, even Ross's own words, trying to understand this incredibly complicated and contradictory person.
We've wrestled with some tough questions, about the nature of evil, the possibility of redemption, and really the limits of what we can understand about other people. And while we might never fully grasp what led Michael Ross to do these terrible things, his case shows us how important it is to dig deeper, to challenge our assumptions, and to keep searching for understanding, even when we're faced with the unthinkable.
This deep dive hasn't given us easy answers, but hopefully it's given you a lot to think about.
Right.
What are your takeaways? What sticks with you about this case? We really encourage you to check out the source material. The links are in the show notes. And please share your thoughts with us.
Because even in the darkest stories, there are insights to be found, different perspectives to consider, and conversations we need to have. And that's what the deep dive is all about.